Have you ever wondered why your favorite taco is costing you an arm and a leg these days? Or is your dream couch still in backorder status for months now? Join us as we go behind the scenes of the global supply chain. Let us discuss and understand its complexity and learn from the industry leaders, professionals, and subject matter experts. Expect in-depth analysis and genuine conversations about the major issues affecting the supply chain today. Welcome to Supply Chain Demystified. Your host is none other than the distinguished supply chain expert, Dr. Nick Vyas. Professor Vyas is the academic director of USC Marshall Global Supply Chain Management and founding executive director of USC Marshall Randall R. Kendrick Global Supply Chain Institute.
Welcome to Supply Chain Demystified. In this episode today, we're going to be talking about the state of the supply chain. As we know, the supply chain has been in the center of every conversation, not only at the White House and at the other countries' government's offices, but in the kitchen tables. Grandparents, kids, in the kindergartens, they're all talking about supply chain. So certainly something has happened over the last few years that has led us to really talk about the supply chain. So today, I really want to get to the state of the supply chain. How did we get here? Where are we today? And where are we likely to be post-COVID? It is my extreme pleasure to welcome my dear friend, known him over 2 decades, who is one of the most forethought and well-renowned leader in supply chain industry. Over 3 decades, he has worked in international settings, running global complex operations. Today, he's in charge of one of the most critical assets that we have in the United States, which is our port. Between Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach, known as the San Pedro Bay, controls over 40% of the goods that comes into our country. Under his leadership, over a decade, he has actually created incredible efficiencies, innovation, and truly allowed, in spite of the headwinds, run our port infrastructure in the best capacity. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome my dear friend, Executive Director of Port of Los Angeles, Gene Seroka. Gene, welcome.
Thanks, Nick. It's great to be here with you.
So, our world of supply chain certainly has evolved rapidly since you and I started. So just for the audience, how did you get into supply chain? What was your take in terms of coming into the space and being in supply chain over the last several decades?
Nick, I got very lucky. Coming out of undergraduate school at the University of New Orleans and then attaining my MBA at that same school, I graduated when the price of oil was below $10 a barrel. And in that region, if the energy markets are suffering, it means the banks aren't doing too well. And of course, New Orleans is so well known for its tourism business, nobody was hiring. So this was in the days before email and the internet. I was sending letters out to every Fortune 500 company, and I was collecting every rejection letter, keeping them in a briefcase, using it as motivation. I ran out of companies to write to, so I went to a small firm in New Orleans, a headhunter, a search firm, and gave them my pitch as to who I was and how I could be valuable to a company. They had done some work with American President Lines before that, and I was lucky enough to be able to get an interview. But the interesting thing was my dad worked for American Airlines, and the company found that out. And they thought if I could fly for free up to Cincinnati from New Orleans, I could get that interview. I sure did. If I did well in that interview, unbeknownst to me, I was going to fly from Cincinnati up to Chicago to go meet the big boss, also for free, have an interview inside the terminal at O'Hare International Airport. This was also at a time where you could just walk right in, sit down near the gate. So we had a great discussion with a man by the name of John Shubkagel, who ultimately offered me a job at a very entry level at American President Lines, which was then a very strong trans-Pacific ocean carrier and grew into a very large carrier during my time there. It was quite fortunate to be in line with those folks at the same time, and the fact that my dad got me airline tickets.
What a story, Gene. I certainly I can relate to that all of us, our generation specifically, we all have taken a detour into the supply chain because there was no such thing as a supply chain major, right? I came out of industrials and systems engineering, wanted to be a hotshot consultant, and little I knew, ended up in operation, right? And one thing led to another. Here I am, just like you, spending the rest of our lives in supply chain. And what has really impressive for me, and I'm sure you can relate to this, is that our world of supply chain has evolved from the time we started to now. It certainly has become global, certainly has become a lot more complex, but it also is fascinating because nothing is same as it was yesterday.
Yeah, you look at this supply chain, Nick, and it's kind of like if you have an interest in music or acting, or if you're a runner, a tennis player, a golfer, you're always looking to improve. You're looking to do your score better, run to a better time. That's the supply chain. It's never going to be perfect. It's never at its all out best, but there's always an opportunity to improve, to work your craft, to become better. And I think that's the best analogy I can give the viewers today. It is now coming into our living rooms every day and night on the national and international news. More folks around the dinner table have an understanding of the global supply chain than you and I did when we were coming up.
That is so true. I mean, remember, I could recall so many incidents over a glass of wine, somebody asking me a question, what do you do? And I said, well, I'm in supply chain. And they're like, what is that? And I'm not going back 20, 30 years. I'm talking about 10 years ago. I hope you agree with me that you and I don't face those questions anymore.
Yeah, it's funny, Nick. I was at the grocery store a couple of weekends ago, and the lady that was checking me out at the stand asked if things were better down there at the port. So yeah, I think it's safe to say that just about everybody's been following us recently.
Absolutely. So let's get to that point. Supply chain was invisible, which is how we like to always operate, right? That we do things behind the scene. It should feel like that never existed until it breaks. But this pandemic of century, or COVID, really created a unique situation for humanity. And the reason I say the humanity, because this disruption was completely end-to-end. It did not discriminate any continent, did not discriminate any size of your economy or geographical boundaries. What are the important supply chain lessons, Jin, that you think that the COVID highlighted that we failed to see prior to the COVID?
Well, there were a number of issues in the supply chain that were just simply spotlighted by the stress put on the system during COVID and this amazing surge in consumer buying that we've witnessed in the US. I think what's come to light is that those of us working in the supply chain feed, house, and clothe America. The work that we do reaches all boundaries and all efforts for us as citizens here in this country and global citizens. The spotlight that's been on us can never be too bright. And here in Los Angeles, whether it be at this fine University of Southern California or at this great port of Los Angeles, we relish in that spotlight being on us because it gives us the opportunity to have our message amplified. What we need to do, how we need to improve, who needs to come to the table and make sure that we can show those areas that need that improvement and find ways to fix them. It's through that great collaboration from the private sector, from public, the government, as well as academia that really gets this conversation to a whole new level. And we moved out more cargo than ever before here at this Port of Los Angeles during the amazing surge of cargo flow. But Nick, it was like taking 10 lanes of LA freeway traffic and squeezing them into 5. You're still moving a lot. But if the person next to you doesn't let you into that lane as they start to merge, you're going to get held behind. And that's exactly what we saw. So it comes down to collaboration, communication, data, and finding ways to invest in our supply chain that has been a necessity for decades now. I think finally we're starting to see that, both with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act at the federal level, Governor Newsom's proposed budget here in California, and the private sector investment that will follow both of those.
That's great. It's great to see all forces working together, trying to enhance our throughput and capability of driving the efficiencies within supply chain. But let's demystify the very first point the viewer might have. How did we get here? So, you and I have spent substantial time in Asia. Let's go back, rewind the clock 30, 35 years ago. Walk us through, Gene, how rapidly this industrialization and globalizations, we're talking about it, that has changed the confluence of our world of global supply chain management.
Most of this, Nick, as you know, has happened during our lifetimes. Predating us was the invention of the container in the late 1950s by Malcolm McLean. And it was the ability to put more cargo on larger vessels and keep it safe from pilferage or damage than ever before. That meant we could do more on the manufacturing side. We could buy more finished goods. And what we found in the 1970s and 80s, we could outsource more of the manufacturing to Asia, meaning we were going to be importing so much more volume of product and keeping price points at a relatively stable level. We outsourced so much cargo that, in fact, we saw double-digit growth for the better part of 2.5 decades in the Trans-Pacific trade alone. Growth forecasts were based on domestic GDP growth rates times 4 or 5 at the time. That's how fast this marketplace was growing. It created jobs in logistics and manufacturing, in warehousing and other areas, including our great dock workers and truck drivers to move all this cargo back and forth. And what we saw in more recent times was, unfortunately, trade policy that put taxes on imports and caused other countries like China to bring in retaliatory tariffs against American farmers and manufacturers. Go to the end of 2019, we saw the business at the Port of Los Angeles drop by some 16% because a lot of importers were bringing in goods before those tariffs or taxes went into place. Then COVID-19 hit China, the central government effectively shutting down the economy, including the manufacturing sector. For the first 5 months of 2020, the Port of Los Angeles saw another 19% drop in cargo. So for about 8 months, we were not importing or exporting, for that matter, a normal volume of cargo. Then suddenly, in the summer of 2020, the American consumer's buying power took off like we've never seen before. Many American importers just simply tried to keep up with this great demand. It was a time where a family outing on the weekend may be for us going to Costco or Target stores because everything else was closed. We were buying more online than ever before, and in fact, doubled online buying as a percentage of retail sales in about a 12-month period that took us a decade to build. So the entire supply chain going through a pandemic also reemerged with this unbelievable power of the American consumer.
Oh, absolutely. And so let me reflect on a couple of points that you brought up. First of all, I think the invention of what is now known as a container, but the book called the box, if we just reflect on that invention, I think that invention is as important as the internet or many other things in our lifetime that we've witnessed, but never get talked about it But you think about the standard containerization, it reduced the cost of freight movement by into pennies. What was on a tonnage basis, few dollars, what it would have cost us to move goods locally, not even talking internationally, it started costing us in pennies. And partly is because the box, the container, allowed us to drive the efficiency. The load factor went up dramatically. The processing of the container cargo became so efficient because everything was standardized. I think that invention, we often don't credit in terms of how that created sort of a pivot, was those containerization modes of transportation, what drove what the globalization was able to take the advantage of. The second point I wanted to bring up is 3 decades rather, the growth in import and certainly the export. But often the political conversation comes up that the reason of this supply chain disruption is because globalization. And I often remind through my writings and speaking that globalization has done an incredible good for the humanity. Close to 1.2 billion people have been lifted out of extreme poverty into the consumable class. A lot of these customers that we, American companies, can tap into it as the future consumers. Think about the middle class, rising middle class in China, India, in ASEAN, Latin America. So Gene, from the perspective, you running the port, how do you see these narratives about there is an urge to blame globalization on the disruption rather than some of the structural deficiencies that we might be exposed to? What are your views on that?
Well, Nick, hindsight is always 2020. And those opinion makers can look back and see how the world could be a better place. We've got to live in the here and now. And those of us who project, who forecast, are trying to get it right, like threading a needle from 700 meters away. But I will say this, that during this pandemic and the stress that's been put on the supply chain, it's not just the transportation aspect of what we're talking about here. As you teach your students, and much of your research indicates, both applied and primary, it's how this entire sourcing mechanism works, what we do in the areas of procurement, how we look at who is going to make the goods, where and when, and how we bring all those parts and components together. Sometimes not always recalled in conversation is the fact that at our nation's largest port here in Los Angeles, 20% of our imports are parts and components for American factories. In addition to that, what we've learned during this pandemic and the surge is that maybe there's more fine-tuning that has to take place. Just like I talked about at the beginning about the supply chain and always working your craft, the same can be said for procurement, sourcing, transportation, and this entire network, including what we also call a demand chain. Having better principles around forecasting, having greater data insights, but also locating companies that are putting inputs into this manufacturing process at more near located positions or closer located positions to the manufacturing process will also do us well. Again, the conversation comes up about nearshoring and onshoring, and we've got to continue to find that sweet spot every time. Even if we replaced all of the imports and reshored them back here into the US economy, it's a very small percentage of overall GDP. But creating better inputs for the output of the finished good at an affordable price so this churn can take place more fluidly is the point that we want to get to. No one wants to go online and see out of stock. None of us want to go into the store and see empty shelves. We've got to have a better preparedness within that supply chain to make sure goods are available for both the industrial and the consumer levels. So there'll be much more to do in this area. We've got to have rules-based trade agreements that allow us that reciprocity. We've got to get the American farmer and manufacturer back into the international game. So all of this has an undertone that's heavily skewed to a domestic commitment, but also knowing that that global economy will and needs to continue to flourish.
Well, I'm glad that you provided that perspective, because I often get talked about and asked this question about decoupling. And there is an undertone in our country, as well as Western democracies, is that all our ills of our supply chain can be cured by bringing everything close to home. And I don't think the supply chain network design can actually justify everything to be decoupled. So yes, I'm a big proponent, as you know, I've written substantially about decoupling without deglobalization. It is what makes sense and how you can diversify your supply chain. Remember, when we were talking about decouplings of supply chain, this word was sort of a foreign word in our industry. Last week, Monday, the head of the World Bank, first time on record, spoke that diversifying supply chain networks are good for humanity. Basically, undertone of that statement was a lengthy op-ed that he had published, talking about how do we become not only efficient supply chain network designers, but also become resilient, sustainable, and agile all at the same time. So we feel like our industry, the professionals, policymakers, we all have to sort of come together and sort of demystify this concept that cost is the only objective, that we all have to focus on it, but then focus on this other variable. I would love to hear your perspective about this multidimensional, what I call triple bottom line driven mindset, where yes, we want to be efficient, but also we also need to think being resilient and being sustainable needs to be part of that. How do you view that?
Oh, agree with you 1,000%. You know, a lot of the business folks that we have in common in our work, Nick, tell us about de-risking their supply chain, making sure that they have the ability to use exception management when things don't necessarily go to plan, and they never go to plan. So that resiliency aspect is so important, and the sustainability piece. As we've worked on together and here at the Port of Los Angeles, there is no port complex in the world that has taken on the efforts to help the resistance against climate change, reducing diesel particulate matter now by 90% here, sulfur oxide by 97%, and nitrogen oxide by about 65%. Our next big chunk at this is going to be removing CO2 or greenhouse gases. And that's done with our aspiration to be a zero emission port by the year 2030 and have zero emission heavy duty trucks by the year 2035. But that triple bottom line as a guiding principle is something that we use every day. And I know many in the supply chain are beginning to focus their efforts on that. For those who also look in the rearview mirror, cost is a reason that we're at this point today. I can remember days where it was a lounge chair container coming from South China to Los Angeles for the unheard of price of $900 a container. And there's much been made today about how much containers cost and where that's going, et cetera. This thing has ebbed and flowed to the max, delivering certainty in the supply chain, whether you're a logistician, looking at a private sector business, or what government wants to deliver in services, is going to be a prime component to that triple level bottom line.
I completely agree with you. And you know, last week, Gene, I was in Asia. As you know, I was in Singapore, and good friends and, you know, PSA, efficiencies, automations, innovations. A lot of this conversation about nearshoring and decouplings of supply chain always comes back to, are we ready at home to be able to absorb the type of volume that we would need? And not infrastructure only at the port, but we're also talking about outside of the port, because if you think about port as a gateway chain point in our initial node of supply chain, they need the pull from the port, from the drayage standpoint into the warehouses, so that's middle mile and then the last mile. So it's not just support, but entire infrastructure. I know you talked about the $1 trillion infrastructure bill that has passed and Build Back Better initiatives. How do you see that with those efforts and some of the political discussions on where that money gets spent, how that money gets spent, and at the end of the day, how much truly makes it into the true project? Do you think we are ready to absorb, and I'm using arbitrary number, 10 to 20% of decoupling, if that were to happen? Do you think we are ready as a country to be able to absorb that level of demand, not just at the port, but throughout the supply chain?
No, and we've shown we're not, Nick, and that's where we've got to work these on parallel paths. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act has been a tremendous boost to our confidence. And now, as you rightly say, we've got to get the Appropriations Committee to get that money out the door, as they say in Washington. $17 billion has been designated to ports and waterways throughout the country. Nick, as you well know, in Singapore, that's the dollar value of moving the port complex from downtown out to Tuas. One country, one port. Here in California, Governor Newsom has put together a proposed budget with $2.3 billion outlined for ports, including 1.2 on those ready projects. That's great. We've got 11 municipal ports here in the state. It's a good start, but we need this type of effort every budgeting cycle. So while we get off the ground here with some really encouraging work, it's incumbent upon all of us in the supply chain to keep up that effort for consistent investment on behalf of the government, because that sends those indicators to private sector that the country, the state of California, are open for business. And if we're going to take on this continued move in the supply chain from a leadership role on the stage of world trade, we're now going to have to leapfrog other trading nations. And that's going to come down to the bricks and mortar infrastructure to ensure we have the necessary capacity and flex in that capacity, as well as the digital infrastructure that I know we're going to talk about here today.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we're going to get to the digital infrastructure, but I want to demystify the second point, because every time there is a highlight news about the ports being backlogged, I have sort of reflected with the data that we call the peak season, that the peak season used to be once a year phenomena that we would plan and prepare for it. I think peak season now is every month. Let's bring our viewers to some data points where you can tell us that the effect of that stimulus money and blockage of discretionary spending in movies, concerts, travel, restaurants. When you stop that channel, all of a sudden, obviously, we have this increased savings, 18% increase in savings over the last 3 years. And many of those dollars went to the discretionary spending. Jin, how do you rationalize that your ability to handle this peak season, because this delays and the backlog at the ports are not the lack of efficiencies and productivity, but rather just exuberant demand of processing volume day in and day out?
Yeah, Nick, as you rightly say, we've averaged a peak season month for about the last 20 months consecutively. Just amazing. And when you've heard the old adage, you don't know what you can do until you've been put to the test, man, have we been put to the test. Our longshore dock workers have been out on the job averaging 6 days a week since the early days of the pandemic in March of 2020. The average exchange of a vessel, meaning the loading and unloading of containers off each vessel that comes to the Port of Los Angeles at more than 11,000 container units per call, is the best in the business around the world. And if I could isolate one area where we need to improve, and I've said to you before, there's not one lever we can pull and fix all this supply chain work. But if we keep the vessels, the work, the cargo, the trucks, and the trains moving at a good pace, this cargo is going to flow. And we're not going to see ships backed up to the tune of 109 like we did earlier this year. But it's when cargo sits, because we get into an environment of ordering just in case as opposed to just in time, that things start to back up. So I think we've got the ability to manage this. Again, we're starting to see things before they become problems and address them. This collaboration led by the White House and these daily, weekly calls that are attended by the C-suite of private sector business have been very helpful in doing just that. The way we spend our money, Nick, as you rightly point out, is very accurate. We weren't flying on airplanes. We weren't going to restaurants or ball games, weren't going to the movies. We were spending our money in other ways, but still, many Americans were saving. We now have about $2 trillion in savings in the United States, but there still is a gap even between the middle class and those who need to improve their lot in life. We've got to find a way to bridge that gap. That's very important to all of us. At the same time, even as the economy has opened up in recent months, we're going to be spending more and more money in the service sectors, bringing more folks back to the restaurants, more people back to the tourism industries, the business hotels. But here's the other thing that we need to watch. Imports will plateau. In fact, they may decline modestly because much of what we did in the last year and a half was on durable goods, appliances. Some of us redid our kitchens, bought new couches, set up a new outdoor deck, whatever it may have been. I bought golf clubs to get back into the game after 15 years, and the shirts and the shoes and all that didn't help my score much, but I was out there because the gym was closed. We're not going to have those types of purchases recurring on a consistent basis. We will still have the fuel to present this economy with us being 70% of GDP, but maybe in a different way. Those remodels and those one-time purchases are not going to happen every single year, much less every business quarter. So we'll see the ability to adjust. We'll see the ability now to focus maybe on a national export policy and getting people on the job through training. We still have 10.7 million job openings in the country in a variety of areas. In our supply chain, where I could argue we need more dock workers right away, but we're at full employment. We also need a large number of truckers and warehouse people across the nation. So there are segments that are really in need of infusing great talent, and others that we got to continue to cultivate and build on with those great skills.
Yeah, so Jenny, if I may, I'm going to take it one step further on the human capital. I think since World War II, this is the first time we're at the crunch in terms of full employment. I am getting calls, if not every day, at least a few times a week from companies looking for supply chain analysts. It says, Nick, can you give me 5, 10 interns for the summer? And there's truly a shortage, especially the shortage in field of supply chain, end to end. You mentioned the front end of our supply chain, but the middle and then the back end, we truly have a huge deficit. And I don't think as a higher education institute that we're doing as much as we can from USC standpoint, but I think this is a collective efforts that we need to start to think about, that we don't all have to have master's degrees, but we can specialize our skill sets by gaining some certifications, which our institute, we really provide those, but enhancing the skill sets so that you become a valuable member of what I call one of the most exciting industry now, which is supply chain.
Yeah, and if you could boil it down to its most simple format, Nick, we're buying more products, which means we have to ship more, and we need more people to manage that. No matter what part or what segment you're in this consumer demand chain or the supply chain that provides those goods, it's growing. You need more good people to move all that product, whether they be in an office like me or out there on the docks and everywhere in between. I think you've hit it spot on.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, so let's get into my very favorite subject here now. You know, as we talked about, the globalization over 3 decades created a complex web of supply chain network. All along, we drove tremendous efficiencies in terms of the movements of goods. But in spite of that, 40% of inefficiency in our supply chain that is laden today, large portion of that inefficiency, the friction, comes from the data side, right? We, as much as we have collaborated cross-border trade and movements of goods, when it comes to data and adopting the technology that's good for the village, so to speak, has been the biggest struggles that we have faced. We continue to face that struggle. And let's demystify this, that why the technological innovation and evolution is so critical for us when we talk about the triple bottom line, because you simply will not and cannot deliver sustainability, which requires tremendous track and trace capability, agility, which requires an incredible insight onto world events, but being able to make decisions, both predictive and prescriptive, in terms of the advanced forecasting capabilities and creating agility within the supply chain, and obviously the efficiency. So if you look at it in a holistic way, everything points to why are we not being able to take care and take advantage of an incredible advancement in the technological evolutions that industry has offered. What do you think? Why are we so resistant in adopting? And I know you launched under your leadership that I had a chance to work with the port solution, the data portal. So let's walk us through, why do you see that we struggle as an industry to sort of embrace and adopt the technological advancement?
Well, we're such a siloed industry by nature, Nick. We've got dozens of players in the supply chain by segment alone who have not necessarily wanted to share their data for fear of their competitors getting a hold of it, or worse yet, someone else aggregating that data and then selling it or monetizing it, and the owner of the proprietary information not realizing that financial gain. You've got laggards, obstructionists, and the rest of us. Sharing data of a generic, non-competitive level is a must in many other trading nations around the world. If you want to bring a ship into a certain location, you have to share your data to get those berthing rights. Why should it be different here in the United States? And what we've done at the Port of Los Angeles is co-create with the Wabtec company, the Port Optimizer, the nation's first and still only port community system. And all we've asked is to bring data points together for 3 basic reasons: give folks visibility, the necessity of exception management when things don't go right, and analytics to understand what's happening and how to get better. Now, what we're seeing through the Department of Transportation initiative under Secretary Pete Buttigieg is the flow concept, the freight logistics optimization works that is a coalition of the willing, bringing folks together from all points in the domestic supply chain to share information on their international cargo. And the ability to get that done is just to take those other pieces out and remove the worries about selling data, about using it untowardly. We have the ability to put together in place data sharing agreements like we've done here in Los Angeles, contracts of commitment to be great stewards of the digital infrastructure like we are of that physical infrastructure you've come to know over the past 115 years. So we've got to demystify, as you rightly say. We've got to take the worry out of those folks who have not gotten in the game and bring the people along that we need to make this a more competitive national offering on the international stage.
And that's a great way to reflect on things that you've been able to achieve, albeit it's a one port in a scheme of things, but the work needs to be done in such a large scale. And this is something, hopefully under the new leadership, we see some initiatives, some governance, some guidance coming out of the White House to continue to promote and support this level of collaboration, because without which the friction, it destroys our ability to drive efficiencies. And at the end of the day, the consumer bears the cost of inefficiencies.
That's right. And I was at the White House for the announcement of this with Secretary Buttigieg and National Economic Council Director Brian Deese. And let's make sure the audience understands this. The federal government has amazing convening powers. You get a call from the Secretary of Transportation, you'll attend the meeting that he or she is organizing. The ability to get those folks in the room, the strong private sector contributors, simply means that there will be a private sector solution. It will not be big government looking at your data or holding it. It will not be a government-run operation for those who are concerned. This is about bringing people together who have a like-minded goal of improving this supply chain, and our common delivery of that product to the American consumer and manufacturer. If we do this right, it will be more consistent and more affordable than ever before. And what American would disagree with that proposition?
Absolutely. I think it's a brilliant put. So if I may even further demystify that point, is as you and I are very familiar with Singapore, the notion that we tend to somehow feel the government is a bad, government is bureaucratic organization that always hinders your ability. We have models. The public-private partnership can work incredibly well if executed right. If the right stakeholders are engaged at the concept to design to execution, we can move a lot of this unnecessary burden out of our system in a very graceful way. So I hope our audience agrees that we need more public-private partnership, not less. And when we say public-private, it's not government mandating, nor the government holding on to things that they want, rather government and the private industry working together, bringing even academia into the equation to make sure we have a best-in-class sort of a thought processes engaged to efficiently drive our supply chains to what it's capable. Because other countries, right, albeit some of them Asian economies, some of the European economies, they're literally leading in many fronts. And we as an advanced economy should not and cannot afford. So Gene, this has been such an incredible conversation. I think we think about the state of supply chain, time has just flown by. I wanna sort of end with giving you a final reflection on where are we going from here? What is a post-COVID supply chain outlook? If I were to say, take a stab at 2025, 2030, give me your horizon scan.
Yeah, I think we've got a line of sight in a couple of areas, Nick. Data is one of them. To be better prepared, sharing information to be able to forecast and pivot when things don't go our way, but also give those customers of us supply chain service providers opportunity. And think of looking at a computer screen and seeing a heat map on one side, where there may be bottlenecks, where I have to stay away from today, where I may have to go in and fix things. On the other side is an opportunity map. Where's the least amount of friction in the supply chain, where I can get my goods to market. Having that type of intel for the decision maker in the supply chain on how to get their goods from origin to destination could be a big game changer. The next piece is that we're going to get cleaner. Emerging technologies are coming out now where we'll see the ability to get to zero emission faster than ever predicted before. But it's going to take that public-private partnership again in this domain to accelerate the technological development and get funding streams and investors to make these machines and trucks commercially available. And I think the last piece is on the human capital that we covered earlier. whether it be a young person or those who are looking for a change in mid-career, going through an educational process like yours at the Randall Kendrick Global Supply Chain Institute, or the younger kid coming out of school that wants to get involved in this supply chain, in this port complex, which is why we'll be turning dirt here and putting shovels in the ground soon for the nation's first goods movement training center to help bring all folks together. So it's those three pieces I see, but we can't lose sight of our traditional work on infrastructure, on business networks and relationships, and always having that continuous improvement philosophy to get to the triple bottom line that's so important. Nick, it's been a pleasure, and all the best with this great podcast.
Jane, thank you again. And folks, that's a wrap for today's session, State of the Supply Chain. Once again, my dear friend Jane Seroka, incredible insight. Wish you all the best and keep up the good work.
We hope you enjoyed another exciting episode of Supply Chain Demystified. Stay tuned for the next demystifying discussion on the supply chain. Visit uscsupplychain.com to stay up to date on all things supply chain.